The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, not to a friendly capital, not to an allied head of state, not to one of the dozen governments that had spent the previous 18 months extending diplomatic patience to Washington that no previous administration had ever required. The call went to Beijing, and Beijing already knew why. Because 3 weeks earlier, the man making that call had stood in front of cameras in the East Room of the White House and told the world that Canada was an economic burden, that Canadian trade was a form of theft, and that the United States of America did not need its northern neighbor for anything. Not energy, not lumber, not manufactured goods, and not the bilateral cooperation that had quietly, efficiently, invisibly held two of the world's most integrated economies together for 6 decades. He said Canada should be the 51st state. He said it with a smile. He said it like a man who had never read a trade balance sheet and did not intend to start. The Canadian Prime Minister did not smile back. What happened in the 3 weeks between that press conference and that phone call to Beijing is a story about the difference between power and leverage, about the difference between being loud and being prepared, about what happens when a country that has been dismissed as manageable turns out to have spent the previous year building the exact relationships that its dismisser was now desperately trying to build from scratch. Mark Carney had been in Beijing for 4 days by the time Washington made its call. He had not gone as a supplicant. He had not gone to beg for market access or to plead for investment. He had gone as the head of a G7 economy that was, at that precise moment, the most attractive trade partner in the room. Canada had stable institutions. Canada had predictable rule of law. Canada had commodities that China needed: energy, potash, canola, softwood, rare earth processing capacity. And Canada had something more valuable than any of those things. Canada had demonstrated to every government watching that it could absorb a trade war and pivot without panic. The bilateral framework that Carney signed in Beijing covered agricultural market access, critical minerals processing, and a new preferential tariff schedule that would route Canadian canola into Chinese markets at terms that American agricultural exporters had spent a decade trying to negotiate and had never achieved. The agreement was 200 pages long. It had taken 11 months to draft. It had been initialed quietly while Washington was busy announcing tariffs. When the White House press secretary was asked about the timing, she said the administration was aware of Canada's discussions with China and was monitoring the situation closely. She did not explain what monitoring meant. She did not say what the administration planned to do about it. She moved on to the next question. The president's advisors have a term for situations like this. They call it getting caught out. It means the gap between what you said was true and what is actually true has become visible to everyone at once, and there is no fast way to close it. Getting caught out is what happens when you tell the world that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada, and then Canada signs a major trade framework with China, and then the phone call you have to make is to Beijing to ask them politely what exactly Canada got and whether there is anything similar available for you. Beijing took the call. Beijing is very good at taking calls. The Chinese Trade Ministry, according to 3 sources briefed on the exchange, was cordial, thorough, and entirely unhelpful. They expressed interest in continued engagement. They noted that their current negotiating calendar was quite full. They suggested that a formal proposal submitted through standard channels would receive full consideration in due course. Due course, in diplomatic language, means whenever we decide it is convenient for us, which may be never, and you will wait and say thank you. The president, who had built his political identity on the proposition that he alone could deal with China, had called Beijing to ask about a trade framework that the Prime Minister of Canada, a country he had spent 2 months mocking, had just finished signing. The markets noticed before the White House admitted it. The Canadian dollar had been under pressure for 6 weeks, absorbing the initial shock of the tariff announcements, the retaliatory measures, the diplomatic temperature that had been rising since January. On the day the Beijing framework was announced, the Canadian dollar moved 4 cents against the American dollar in a single trading session. That does not sound like much. 4 cents. But 4 cents in a single session on a G7 currency pair is not a fluctuation. It is a verdict. Canadian agricultural exports, Canadian energy equities, Canadian mining stocks. All of them moved on the news, and they moved in one direction. American Farm Bureau representatives in Iowa, in Kansas, in North Dakota were on the phone with their congressional delegations within hours. Not because they had tracked the diplomatic nuances of the Canada-China negotiation, But because canola is canola and soybeans are soybeans, and when Canada gets preferential access to Chinese markets for crops that American farmers also grow, the math is not complicated. You do not need a trade economist to explain it. You need a calculator and about 45 seconds. 3 Republican senators from agricultural states issued a joint statement asking the White House for clarification on the administration's strategy for protecting American farmers from the downstream effects of the Canada-China agreement. The statement was careful. It did not say the administration had made a mistake. It said the administration's strategy required clarification. In political language, those 2 sentences mean the same thing. There is a woman named Sandra who farms 2,400 acres of canola in North Dakota. Her family has farmed that land for 4 generations. Her grandfather broke that ground. Her father irrigated it. She runs it now with her husband and her oldest son, who came back from agricultural college 2 years ago because the operation needed him and because he wanted to be there. Sandra voted for this administration twice. She stood at a rally in Fargo and cheered trade policies she believed would protect her markets. She believed, because she was told, that being tough on trade partners meant being strong for American farmers. She heard about the Canada-China agreement on her truck radio driving between fields. She pulled over. She sat for a while. Then she called her son, who was running the second tractor a quarter-mile north. She told a regional agricultural publication, "Canada is our competition for that Chinese market. Always has been. We've been competing with Canadian canola for 30 years. And now they have a deal with China that we don't have, and we don't have it because we spent the last 2 months in a fight with Canada that I still don't fully understand the point of." I'm not a diplomat. I'm a farmer. But I know when somebody outmaneuvered somebody and somebody just got outmaneuvered. She did not say who outmaneuvered whom. She did not need to. The diplomatic architecture that allowed Carney to walk into Beijing with leverage did not appear by accident. It was built over 11 months, in deliberate sequence, in a way that only makes sense if you understand that the Canadian government had been reading American political signals and planning for their consequences long before those consequences materialized. In April of the previous year, Canada signed a critical minerals cooperation agreement with the European Union. In June, it finalized a clean energy partnership with Japan. In September, it joined a new trade working group with Australia, the United Kingdom, and South Korea, specifically designed to reduce shared dependency on American market access as a negotiating pressure point. Each agreement, taken alone, was incremental. Together, they formed something else entirely. They formed a floor. When the tariff announcements came, Canada did not have to scramble for alternatives. It did not have to accept bad terms from partners who knew it was desperate. It had spent almost a year making sure it would never be in a position where it had no choice. Carney had said something at a press conference in Ottawa in November, before any of this became public, that did not attract much attention at the time. He said, "The strongest position in any negotiation is the position where you genuinely do not need the other party to say yes." He said it in response to a question about something else entirely. A journalist wrote it down. Almost nobody ran it. It turns out he was describing his entire strategy. The White House response to the Beijing framework went through 3 distinct phases in 48 hours, which is itself a kind of record. Phase 1 was dismissal. A senior administration official told reporters that the Canada-China agreement was largely symbolic, that its practical scope was limited, and that the administration was confident the United States retained dominant trade relationships with both countries. This phase lasted approximately 6 hours until the agricultural market data became impossible to dismiss. Phase 2 was reassurance. The press secretary said the president had spoken with several trade advisors and was confident that the United States had strong tools available to respond to any competitive pressure in Asian markets. She did not say what those tools were. She did not say when they would be deployed. She said the president was focused on getting the best deal for the American people, which is a sentence that contains no information but sounds like one that does. Phase 3 was the phone call to Beijing, which, as noted, went poorly. There was a 4th phase, quieter, that happened in the background and was reported by 3 separate outlets within the same news cycle. Senior administration officials reached out to their Canadian counterparts to ask, informally, whether there was still a pathway to restoring the bilateral framework that had been suspended 2 months earlier. The Canadian response, according to a source familiar with the exchange, was yes, there is a pathway. It begins with the same place all negotiations begin. The table. Carney held a press conference in Ottawa on the day he returned from Beijing. He was asked directly whether he had coordinated the timing of the China announcement to maximize diplomatic pressure on Washington. He smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won something, the smile of a man who had prepared for something and watched it unfold exactly as prepared. He said, "Canada does not time its trade relationships as pressure tactics against allies. Canada builds trade relationships because they are good for Canadian workers, Canadian farmers, and Canadian businesses. If those relationships also demonstrate Canada's value as a partner, that is not a tactic." That is the point. He was asked whether he would take the call if the White House requested direct talks on restoring bilateral trade terms. He said Canada was always available to talk. He said Canada had always been available to talk. He said the question was never whether Canada would come to the table. The question was what the terms of the conversation would be. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. There are numbers underneath all of this that do not lie. Canadian exports to China have increased 34% in the 12 months since the new framework negotiations began. Canadian agricultural products now have preferential access to a market of 1.4 billion consumers. Canadian critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, are now subject to a processing cooperation agreement that routes refined materials through Canadian facilities before export, capturing value-added revenue that previously left the country entirely. Meanwhile, the American agricultural trade deficit with China has widened for the third consecutive quarter. American farmers are paying retaliatory tariffs on equipment and fertilizer that are now running 11% higher than they were 18 months ago. 3 major American agricultural export cooperatives have reported their worst quarterly numbers in 6 years. The president said Canada was the 51st state. The 51st state just signed a trade deal that the first state has been trying to sign for a decade. Back home, the political cost has begun compounding in the places it was least expected. Not among critics, not among the opposition, among the base. A steel worker in Pennsylvania who supported this administration and believed its trade rhetoric was about protecting American industry told a regional radio station that he was having trouble explaining to his son why being tough on Canada had resulted in Canada being in a stronger position than when it started. "I thought being tough on trade meant we won something," he said. "I can't find what we won." An energy executive in Texas who had publicly supported the administration's energy agenda told an industry conference that the suspension of the bilateral labor and regulatory frameworks with Canada had added costs to 3 major projects that he could not pass on to consumers and could not absorb indefinitely. He said, and this was the sentence that ran in every trade publication for the following week, "You can be right about wanting better terms and still be wrong about how you go about getting them. Those are 2 different questions, and we confuse them. The cranes are still moving in Beijing, in Ottawa, in Brussels, in Tokyo, in Canberra and Seoul and Riyadh. They are building the architecture of a trade world that is quietly, efficiently, and without fanfare rearranging itself around the spaces left by American withdrawal. Not hostile rearrangement, not ideological rearrangement. Practical rearrangement, the kind that happens when a reliable partner becomes an unpredictable one and other reliable partners fill the gap. Canada did not want this. Carney said so clearly and on the record in November and December and January and February. He said Canada's preference was the integrated North American economy that had worked for both countries for 60 years. He said disruption served no one. He said he hoped for a return to the kind of relationship that had made both countries stronger. He also spent 11 months making sure that if the disruption came anyway, Canada would not be the one left standing with nothing. The president went to China for help after threatening Canada. Canada was already there. And the thing about arriving somewhere first, in diplomacy, in trade, in the long, patient game of building relationships before you need them, is that the person who arrives second cannot simply pretend the sequence did not happen. The deals are signed. The frameworks are in place. The phone calls that matter have already been made. The president called Beijing on a Tuesday morning. Carney had been there 4 days. Some gaps cannot be closed by a phone call. Some positions cannot be recovered by a press conference. Some moves once made by the other side cannot be unmade by the side that was supposed to move first. The cranes keep moving. The table is set, and the seat that matters most in this conversation is the one that was pulled up 11 months ago, quietly, without cameras, while everyone was watching the noise and missing the preparation. Canada was ready. America was loud. The world noticed the difference.